Hi everyone, here we have the second Stash build video. The second kit from Stash Mountain is Model Rectifier Corporation's 1:9 scale Mean Machine from the Judge Dredd universe. Once again, we'll have a look at the high points and low points of the kit. On the sunny side, the detail of the kit is superb, and all of the figure's proportions look accurate to the eye. There are nicely detailed pictures at the back of the box to serve as a painting guide, and the instructions, although not fantastic, are adequate for assembling the model. On the shady side, there's quite a bit of flesh on the smaller parts, which was difficult to remove because the parts were very fragile. Although the model fitted together nicely, there were lots of seam lines which needed to be sanded and filled with putty. Also, there are no call-outs for brand name paints, just vague references to colors at the back. And unfortunately, the completed figure was hopelessly unbalanced. In fact, the instructions even suggest that the figure gets glued in place on the base. Generally speaking, the kit was excellent. The details were easy to paint, and the high-quality mold was very detailed. I give the kit a good rating of 3 golden ostrich eggs. The back of the box has a nicely detailed painting guide. Although no specific paints are mentioned, it's still very useful. This way, we can choose our own colors and paint the figure the way we want to. There are great details of the front and back of the figure. The box contains 2 sprues and the base for the model. I was not sure what the base was supposed to represent, but decided to give it a granite look in the end. The 2 sprues looked like they came from a giant master box kit. They were beautifully molded and very detailed. The mechanical parts were sharp and artificial looking, while the flesh parts were more natural and had smooth features. The instruction sheet was a fairly basic one-pager, and it was easy enough to follow. The kit only has a few parts, so there wasn't any need for anything more elaborate than this. Let's take a quick look at those 2 sprues included in the kit. The detail is very good, especially the scars on the chest, which were nice and deep, which would make painting much easier. There was a bit of flesh on the smaller parts, and that was a pain to remove because the parts were quite flimsy. But patience and persistence certainly paid off. After a quick wash to remove any releasing agents, I was ready to get started. I decided to build the legs first to see how everything fitted together. I cut them from the sprue and test-fitted the parts. This was very tricky and needed a few tries until I was happy with the fit. I glued the 2 halves in stages using Tamiya extra thin cement to minimize the seam lines. For the most part, everything fitted together well, except the left shoe, where the 2 halves were slightly out of alignment. When the legs were done, I followed the same procedure on the torso, the mechanical arm, and the head. The seam lines were quite nasty and needed a lot of work. I filled the gaps of the seam lines with modeling putty and sanded these carefully not to destroy any surface detail. To begin with, I used a rougher 400 grit sandpaper, followed by smoother 2000 grit sandpaper, and finally buffed it up with a nail polish buffer. In order to lower the figurine's center of gravity, I decided to fill the lower half of his body with plaster of Paris. I mixed this in a 2:1 ratio, with 2 parts of plaster to 1 part of water. I added 30 milliliters of cold water to a container and then measured out 60 milliliters of plaster. The plaster was cast into the water by sprinkling it slowly over the surface. The mixture was stirred up and diluted a little more to make pouring easier. I filled the lower half of the figurine with this plaster mixture and let it harden overnight. I applied masking tape to the areas of the model which needed to be glued later. Before continuing, all seam lines were checked to see if any more filling and sanding were necessary. All the parts were primed with a base coat and checked again to see if any more work needed to be done. There was a small hole in the right cheek which needed filling. Everything else looked good to go. I wiped the primed parts off carefully with a micro-meshed cloth dipped in water to remove any dust from the primer coat. I used some putty to fill the hole in the cheek and sanded it smooth. The masking tape from the upper and lower halves of the body were removed, and glue was applied. I carefully fitted the two halves together and left this to dry overnight. The next day, I carefully filled the seams of the join line and sanded away any excess filling putty. The torso was masked off and the legs were painted with Tamiya semi-gloss black and left to dry. Afterwards, I applied a few coats of satin varnish. This gave the pants and shoes a leather look. While waiting for the legs to dry, I gave the parts of the mechanical arm a primer coat of gloss black. Once dry, I followed this by a light coat of Tamiya flat aluminium. The black gloss coat really brought out the shine of the metallic paint. Moving back to the body, I removed the masking material and gave the torso a good coat of Vallejo medium flesh tone. I applied paint to the front and back of the figurine, making sure to fill all the little nooks and crannies and cover all exposed areas. I painted the parts of the head which were flesh and let everything dry. I used a variety of shades from Vallejo's face and skin tone set and blended these very slowly to build up the various shades of the skin tone. At this stage, I used the painting guide at the back of the box extensively to create a realistic skin effect. For me, the scary part in figure painting is doing the eyes. I tried to find some reference pictures for his eyes online, but there wasn't any real definitive version, so I decided to do my own thing. I painted both eyes a piercing green, which I think kind of suited him. I also did his mouth and gave him a set of real gnarly yellow teeth. The next step was to glue the head to the torso. Once again I removed the masking tape before I glued the head. I added some filler, sanded it down and touched up the paint. I masked off the legs and the silver part of the head and gave all the flesh parts a coat of flat varnish. First, I painted the silver parts of his chest with Tamiya gunmetal. To paint the detail on his back, I used the dried blood color from Citadel. I carefully painted all the areas between the metal parts. I thinned the red paint down a lot more and used this around the edges of the wound. I used a thinned down version of the Citadel Dry Blood to paint in the details of the scars on his chest. The model's detail was excellent, and I could apply the paint as a pin wash in most places. The final result looked pretty good. Once the scars were done, I painted other areas of his chest, especially around the metal bits that were sticking out. I used the same thinned down version of the Citadel paint to do his lips and nipples. To highlight the metal parts, I used Tamiya chrome silver and painted them to match the color of the metal on his head. I repeated the process with the metal parts at his back and highlighted a few sections of the metal on his skull as needed. I painted the zipper detail in the front exactly the same way. I painted each section of his mechanical arm separately and glued on the smaller detail parts. I left this step right to the end because those small parts were very fragile. The parts of the mechanical arm were glued to the figurine, and I added paint to any areas that needed touching up. After a quick oil wash of the mechanical arm to bring out the surface details, I was happy with the result. All that was left was to finish the base. Because the figure was so unstable, I added a pair of magnets to each foot and magnets to corresponding areas on the base. I wanted to paint a granite pattern for the base. For this I selected black, white and 3 shades of grey. I thinned down the paints and using an old toothbrush applied the paint in a spatter pattern. I started with a white paint and moved progressively darker until I got to the black paint, allowing the paint to dry between each coat. By the time I finished the final black coat, everything looked a little bit too dark, so I added some more white specks of paint to the base. When the base was finally dried, the granite effect looked pretty realistic. On one occasion, before the magnets were installed, the poor figurine fell so hard that it broke part of his mechanical arm. I figured this would probably happen again, so I decided to try and create a more permanent fix using 2mm copper wire. I wrapped this copper wire around a safety pin to form a small coil. I slipped the coil over the broken parts and glued everything together. This didn't look too bad and proved quite useful when the figure fell over during the filming of the final scene of this video clip. Instead of breaking off, the part just bent to one side and it was fairly easy to straighten again. I forgot to add the metallic piece of his left shoulder. I added this right at the end of the build. And here he is, from the Angel Gang, Pa Elmer Angel's son, Mean Angel, aka Mean Machine. So long, and thanks for watching.